Good day, everyone, and welcome to the webinar series of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. I'm Gaukhar Mukhatzhanova, Japan Chair for World Without Nuclear Weapons here at the center, and your moderator for today. In 2023, at the second meeting, states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons established a new consultative process on addressing their security concerns about the risks posed by nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon policies. The facilitator, appointed Austria, had the mandate to conduct consultations and submit a report. The report was submitted to the third meeting of states parties at the beginning of this month in New York. So today's webinar is dedicated to discussing the report, its rationale, its main findings, recommendations, and potential for impact on nuclear weapon debates in other international fora. And to do that, we have two great speakers. Ambassador Alexander Kmentt, who is Director for the Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Department at the Federal Ministry of Foreign and of European and International Affairs of Austria, and Dr. Oliver Meier, Policy and Research Director at the European Leadership Network. Alexander, who chaired the consultative process, will introduce the report and present its key findings and recommendations, while Oliver will serve as a discussant and provide commentary. After that, we will take questions and hopefully have a good discussion. With that, thank you both speakers for joining us, and thank you all online. And I'm pleased to give the floor to Alexander.
Thank you very much, Gaukhar. Thanks to the VCDNP for hosting this webinar. Let me try to activate this shared screen. So it's an important opportunity for me to present this report that was presented to the third meeting of states parties. So thank you very much. And thanks also to Dr. Oliver Meier to be a discussant afterwards. I'm interested to hear what he has to say. As you said, Gaukhar, this report is the result of a consultative process that came out at the second meeting of states parties in 2023. And we had two mandates, two questions to address, two issues to address in the mandate. The first was to better articulate the security concerns under the TPNW that emanate from nuclear weapons. And the second one was to challenge and juxtapose the nuclear deterrence paradigm and with the scientific evidence on the humanitarian consequences and risks of nuclear weapons. And the purpose of all of this is to promote, of course, the underlying rationale of the TPNW, to assist in universalization efforts, and to get to a better level of engagement with TPNW skeptical countries. And of course, it was the realization that TPNW states parties have not yet been sufficiently successful to get to the engagement on the arguments that underpin the TPNW. Yes, the humanitarian consequences are now widely acknowledged, but skeptics of the TPNW still refer to it as not taking the security environment into account. So the consultations took place over the year of 2024 into early 2025. We developed a whole range of guiding questions. We invited experts to help us address these questions. We sought input from states parties, and then Austria's facilitator, on the basis of that, drafted a report, which then led to further consultations. And the report was then presented at the third meeting in early March and welcomed by states parties. So in short, the whole point of this exercise is that the TPNW is a treaty, to highlight that it's a treaty that is based on profound arguments, based on scientific facts, and that it articulates serious and legitimate security concerns, and that it is therefore a security treaty. So TPNW states parties hope that this report will contribute to a more meaningful engagement on the different perceptions on security and nuclear weapons that obviously exist in the international discourse. So while Austria was the facilitator of this process, we are not the owner of the report. It is a report from TPNW states parties. So the first key points is, obviously there are serious concerns about the humanitarian and environmental consequences of nuclear weapons. If nuclear weapons are used in larger numbers, the consequences would likely be transboundary, complex, cascading, and hence concern the security of all states and all humanity. And these concerns would be graver and have direct impact on TPNW states parties and non-nuclear weapon states worldwide. Humanitarian organizations have underscored that it is impossible to mount adequate response if nuclear weapons are exploded in populated areas. And this evidence on the scale of the consequences is put beyond dispute by peer-reviewed scientific research. And even recently, the G7 Academies of Sciences have underscored this. So obviously, for states that are not engaged in nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, these potential consequences over which they have no say and no control constitute a serious security concern. Secondly, there are security concerns about the risks related to nuclear weapons. So the potential of any detonation of any of the thousands of nuclear weapons, irrespective of the cause, is of course a risk and is a security concern. And these risks are today exacerbated inter alia by the growing salience on nuclear weapons, the heightening of political tensions, careless nuclear rhetoric, and new and disruptive technologies. And some nuclear doctrines are developing in a direction that is increasingly dangerous, that is fragile and fraught with known and unknown risks. And despite this, nuclear deterrence advocates argue currently for an even stronger reliance on nuclear weapons today. So states that are in the neighborhood of nuclear weapons detonations would also suffer severe spillover consequences, such as radioactive contamination and mass populations fleeing from both affected or neighboring areas. EMPs could disrupt vital services also in states not party to a conflict. And such cascading effects would lead to severe infrastructure breakdowns with grave consequences, including the possible breakdown of public order. Research into escalation pathways shows the extreme risks of nuclear escalations. And simulations which include the use of tactical nuclear weapons tend to end with all-out nuclear war. So no region on Earth is immune to this, and all states carry these risks, and all therefore have legitimate security concerns. And given the magnitude of the consequences, nuclear risks must be considered as high. So seeking to eliminate these possibly existential global risks is the responsibility and the legitimate security concern for all states. Thirdly, and consequently, there is a whole range of security concerns about nuclear deterrence, the security paradigm itself. And I would like to highlight some of them, and they are developed in some detail in the report. So proponents of nuclear deterrence credit nuclear weapons with having maintained stability between nuclear armed states over the past decades. And yet, nuclear armed states are continuously seeking to enhance the credibility, the efficiency, and the severity of their nuclear threats, driving technological innovation. So this undermines the notion that nuclear arsenals provide stability because it actually creates a perpetual cycle of modernizing arsenals, of pursuing military advantages, and hedging against adversaries, all of which contribute to arms race dynamics. And we see this dynamic at play right now, which of course creates very serious security concerns. Then nuclear deterrence is a psychological and communicative construct that relies on assumptions of stability, of predictability, and of rationality. It is built on projections of behavior, of sequences, of intentions, and of expected outcomes. But of course, assumptions are subjective and carry the inherent risk of overconfidence. For example, there are several past cases where sheer luck, rather than procedure, sheer luck prevented calamitous developments with nuclear weapons. Then, nuclear weapons have repeatedly not deterred conflicts involving nuclear armed states, nor deterred non-nuclear armed states from actually attacking nuclear armed states. So the assertion that nuclear deterrence has prevented large-scale war for the past decades is one such possible optimism bias. It is based on limited data, on statistically too short a period, and it ignores other contributing factors. There is no certainty that nuclear deterrence has worked in the past or that it will work in the future. Just as much, of course, there is no certainty that nuclear weapons have not prevented conflict in the past or will not do so in the future. But anecdotal evidence is not a reliable guarantee for future effectiveness. The causality between the presence of nuclear threats for the absence of war is impossible to prove conclusively. The underlying assumption, which is of course also a possible confirmation bias of nuclear deterrence theory, is that credible threats and mutual vulnerabilities will lead to mutual restraint. But this assumption abstracts the reality of nuclear consequences, and it abstracts the concrete examination of the catastrophic consequences of failure. Every day, nuclear armed states exercise the actual use of nuclear weapons and credibly signal their readiness to use them, and of course, to inflict catastrophic global consequences. And this is not an unfortunate byproduct of nuclear deterrence, but it is its very foundation. So it's therefore a legitimate security concern to wonder to what extent the consequences on states that are not party to a conflict and are not engaged in nuclear weapons is considered in nuclear planning and targeting, given that they would suffer the consequences of anything going wrong as well. Proponents of nuclear deterrence also claim that it works because it will lead to rational and responsible behavior. But the reasoning that rational actors avoid using nuclear weapons and that nuclear deterrence leads to rational behavior is a circular argument. And it is also an assumption with very high stakes. So nuclear deterrence is a human concept, and every human construct is fallible just as humans are. Accidents, miscalculations, and human or technical error must of course be minimized, but they cannot be eradicated. And given the existential stakes, it's a big leap of faith to rely on the infallibility of political and military decision-making structures in nuclear armed states. All of this is compounded by the fact that nuclear weapons policies and procedures are shrouded in secrecy for national security reasons. There is little transparency about plans to use nuclear weapons and to select targets, for example, in a way that could comply with the rules and principles of IHL. But such information is, of course, vital also for states not party to a conflict. Furthermore, what remedial measures, if any, are in place to address and compensate third states from the effects of nuclear explosions, such as radiation, environmental damage, and other subsequent effects? There's also no accountability, legal or otherwise, regarding the potential consequences of nuclear weapons explosions, even though they would be borne by the entire world. So all of this amounts to very profound and legitimate security concerns for those states whose populations and populations for states who are not engaged in nuclear deterrence. Now, it's certainly very difficult to weigh the security benefits of nuclear deterrence against the uncertainties, assumptions, and the precarious balance of existential threats and risks. But these difficult questions, which are raised in the report, need to be discussed, such as, for example, does the precarious stability of nuclear deterrence justify the global existential risks? Or would the absence of nuclear weapons really increase the risk of conflicts? And if so, does this make it worthwhile to accept the permanent global risk of nuclear annihilation? And who decides that such risks can be taken? And based on what criteria and with which legitimacy? Or does prudence demand the urgent removal of the existential threat of nuclear weapons, because a world where this threat is reduced and removed is in any case safer and more secure? So ultimately, these are very difficult questions, and it's impossible to know for certain. But the uncertainties regarding nuclear deterrence, the nuclear deterrence security paradigm, I think should be acknowledged and be the starting point of the conversation. But the fact that nuclear deterrence can fail, that is undisputed. And if nuclear threats are carried through, there is conclusive scientific evidence to show what this would mean. So TPNW states parties argue to apply the prudential principle, that policy decisions on nuclear weapons should be primarily based on the evidence of what can go wrong and on the prevention and removal of this existential threat and risk. And this is the security rationale that is now enshrined in the TPNW. And of course, one can disagree with these arguments, but these concerns should not be dismissed because they are profound and they are legitimate. Finally, the report contains a number of recommendations to TPNW states parties of how to take the content of this report further. There are some recommendations regarding better messaging, given that the voices and these concerns of the non-nuclear majority tend to be not sufficiently heard, on how to do this better and more efficiently. Then there are recommendations to raise these concerns in a wider range of fora, not just the disarmament and non-proliferation field, but both in different multilateral and regional fora. There are recommendations on engagement with states relying on nuclear weapons, especially regarding transparency. Given that the risks of nuclear weapons are created by these states, yet TPNW states parties have to carry these risks as well. There's a range of recommendations of what level of transparency should be sought, and there are quite granular recommendations on this. And lastly, there are also recommendations on where new research on the risks and consequences of nuclear weapons would be beneficial. And this will be discussed and possibly carried forward by TPNW states parties in the current intersessional period. Now to conclude, Gaukhar, you're already looking at the clock. As we are at an inflection point on nuclear weapons, and some people say that we are already in a third nuclear age, having this much broader international science and societal conversation about nuclear weapons is very important. And these perspectives that I've outlined in the report are underrepresented in much of the debate about nuclear weapons, including in the current debate going on in Europe, I would like to add. So nuclear weapons are, in the public discourse, often equated one-on-one with security. It's postulated that they will provide security. Very few people, or journalists for that matter, are asking follow-up questions if this is really so. But what are the risks involved? What are the risks of something going wrong? What happens if something goes wrong? How stable is nuclear deterrence? What deters and how? What do we want to deter, and are there better ways of doing this than by threatening nuclear holocaust? What does all of this mean for the global nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime, and the NPT in particular, and our efforts to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons? So these are all crucial questions that should be discussed in a much broader discourse, as I said, before we are sliding back into nuclear arms race dynamics. So TPNW states parties hope that this report and the points raised in it will contribute to such a broader discourse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander, for that introduction to the report and its findings, and I hope we'll tease out some of those arguments further in the discussion and discuss and touch also upon the next steps for the conversation. But before we do that, I'm glad to give the floor over to Dr. Oliver Meier for his commentary.
Thank you, Gaukhar, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to comment on the report. As you said in the beginning, I'm Policy and Research Director with the European Leadership Network. I should note that, I'm speaking only from my personal perspective. The ELN doesn't take any positions on these type of policy debate as an institution. So what you're going to hear is really my take on this report, which is a really useful report and a great report. Congratulations to Alexander and all those involved in drafting and writing it. I think it's a very useful report because it collates the arguments why, from a human security perspective, nuclear deterrence is a risky notion and a risky concept that needs to be overcome. I think it's also very useful because it connects that debate to newer developments. For example, the trend towards mission creep around nuclear deterrence that we observe and have observed for some time, and attempts to broaden nuclear deterrence, the role of nuclear weapons to also deter strategic non-nuclear threats, including cyber threats. It also connects the debate to the role of emerging and disruptive technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, and in this way also I think updates the debate we've seen when the treaty was negotiated and finally adopted. So I think that's very timely and provides TPNW states and the broader disarmament community with a very useful tool and compendium of the arguments one can bring to the table 8 years after the treaty was adopted in the General Assembly. But this articulation of the security concerns, as Alexander has said, is only one purpose of the report. The other one is to challenge the deterrence paradigm and to engage TPNW skeptics by providing a basis for, as Alexander wrote for the ELN actually a while ago, to provide a basis for productive conversations about security and nuclear weapons and the veracity of arguments for and against nuclear deterrence. And it's here, you didn't invite me presumably to just praise the report, where I want to come in and offer some criticism maybe and some thoughts on what can be done to engage those critics and skeptics of the report. And I do that as somebody sitting in a non-nuclear weapon state that is allied with 3 nuclear weapon states, speaking to you from Berlin and working with a network that in itself brings together people with a wide range of views on these issues. And I do think the report maybe can do a slightly better job at engaging with those who discuss nuclear weapons from the viewpoint of strategic stability. So a couple of thoughts on that. To be sure, there are some states, and certainly, many nuclear weapon states that do not want and probably never will engage with TPNW arguments, and we just, have to take that as a fact of life for now. But if TPNW supporters want to successfully chip away at the edges, if you like, of the debate, particularly in those non-nuclear weapon states allied with nuclear weapon states, they must think about how to best do that. And the track record is not very good, I would argue. It's been a challenge to make these inroads into debates, particularly in allied states. The hostility of nuclear weapon states towards the TPNW is unchanged. That is probably one of the few issues left among the P5 or the nuclear 5 that they can agree on. More concerning is that nuclear allies are less willing to engage constructively. This was the first MSP where no NATO state participated as an observer, if I'm not mistaken. That's a concerning trend, and much to my regret, Germany also decided for the first time not to observe. The Japanese government, there was some debate, and there are questions on this already in the Q&A, decided not to observe the meeting. So this is another reason why it's good to think about how to better engage these countries. And also, I found very little press coverage of MSP3. Now, this is a general trend. We can also observe in the NPT that the media interest in these issues is, from this perspective, is no longer there. But it is another indication that we need to think about how to engage with the debates that are going on, and that Alexander already referred to. Part of the explanation, of course, for these trends lies in Russia's nuclear threats and the concerning developments we've seen around the war in Ukraine and against Ukraine. But it's also a reason, I think, to think again about why TPNW states have not been better at tipping the balance in these debates, particularly in countries engaged in extended deterrence relationships. So what can be done to, as Ireland has said, integrate the arguments more organically with universalization efforts, and to better understand the apparent growing turn to nuclear weapons among states. I think that's the challenge that I think Ireland correctly pointed out. The report did rightly point out that the extent to which divergent security perceptions can be bridged or at least addressed constructively in order to forge a more common path ahead on how to deal with the existential threat of nuclear weapons is a key challenge for international security. So let me say a few words on this, briefly touching on the tone, substance, and the fora. On the tone, there's sometimes, I think, unfortunate tendency to lecture, if I can say so, to be blunt here, to those who believe that nuclear weapons enhance stability. Lecturing in politics usually doesn't get you very far if you want to make progress. Somebody tells me that he wants to have a discussion, engage with me, but at the same time tells me that their view is clear, quote, unambiguous and confirmed by science. And also at the same time tells me that my view of the world is, quote, dangerous, misguided, unsustainable, and unacceptable. My appetite for discussion is probably not so big. I do think it's possible to lay out your own worldview and at the same time acknowledge the legitimacy of those who disagree with you. And I think here, the inclusive approach that the report is pursuing could be broadened more. There are those, sometimes even in nuclear weapon states, but particularly in states with extended deterrence relationships, who do view nuclear weapons as a necessary evil, but have doubts themselves. And I think those you should be trying to engage in parliaments, but also in governments where you can not to convince them, but to really compare analysis and facts and figures. So on what issues could such engagement takes place? And I just want to give you bullet point style 5 issues, and we can discuss that in the Q&A. The report itself, under this section of engagement with states relying on nuclear weapons, usefully lists 2 very good topics: transparency, to systematically demand more information from armed states. There's a long list of questions, really interesting questions, which I don't want to discuss. But often the tone, I would say, is more to confront rather than to engage, and ask people to do more without actually getting your head around the arguments why more transparency may actually be problematic. Risk reduction is the second very good topic. And there's a similar problem here by talking about inherent risks and only challenging notions around deterrence that can make it difficult to engage. So what are the intermediate steps, particularly when it comes to emerging disruptive technologies that states could and should take? There is a discussion of negative security assurances, which is very good, but is it also possible to talk about positive security assurances and the role they play? That's really where the action is right now, and where there's a lot of discussion in Europe particularly, but also in South Korea, in Japan, and how this comes into the equation. And I didn't find much on that on the report that would be able, would enable us to engage with that debate. Another topic is the very good topic of positive obligations that the report touches upon. Countries like Germany, for example, are willing and have contributed to efforts around victims assistance, environmental remediation, but can that be done also in a way that enables to join forces here on this issue? And the final point is probably the most tricky one and has been much discussed for a long time, responsible and irresponsible behavior. And there's a blanket rejection of, to get into that debate. But I think that's something that that also is something where you can get into the debates also in states allied with nuclear weapon states. And in Berlin, for example, you quite often hear that as long as TPNW states are not willing to address Russian nuclear threats, this is really difficult to engage with these debates. Final point, where should such discussions take place? The section on bodies and forums to engage makes 6 very useful suggestions, but the NPT is mentioned, I think, only once in the sections and not very prominently. Comes in the whole report up only twice. There's a lot of mention of the non-proliferation regime more generally. For me, the NPT has to be the central venue, forum, where to have these debates. And I wish there would have been more thinking about how to take these issues to the NPT. We have a PrepCom around the corner, and it'd be interesting to see how reactions to the report are there. So let me maybe stop there. This is a really good report, to say that again, but I think there's some room for improvement if you really want to take these arguments forward in states, particularly allied with nuclear states, and the same demand that you put on nuclear weapon states to acknowledge the uncertainty of their own argument. I think also would be good if TPNW states are a bit more open to acknowledge the uncertainty about their own arguments. Thanks again.
Thank you all. Those great set of comments, and we'll engage on a number of them in this discussion as we're going. So I have some follow-up questions to both of you, and both of you have addressed already partially some of the things that I was hoping to ask. So in a sense, that's probably making my job easier. And then we're also getting some questions online, and those of you online, please use the Q&A function to post your questions. Several people have already made use of that, so please use the Q&A. But first, to pick up on one of the last points that Oliver made, and to address it to Alexander, with regard to where the discussion should take place, but more broadly, what do you, Alexander, think or hope should happen next with the report, its findings? What do you envision the states parties, TPNW states parties, doing and in terms of taking it forward, be it in the NPT or other fora? So let's start there.
Thanks a lot, Gaukhar. Thanks also to Oliver for very good comments, which I take as very constructive criticism, and I'm happy to go into more detail on that. We actually had a lot input for recommendations and many ideas. But in the drafting of the report, we also heard, and then we followed that advice, that we should not be too prescriptive in detail in the report, because the report itself is not the tool. The report is the result of a special mandate that we had. It's the basis from which states parties can draw for actions that they want to take. So we included this in the recommendations, but in fairly generic terms. Obviously, the NPT is a forum where TPNW states parties have been very active. So it goes without saying that these are the sort of obvious fora. So it's the NPT, it's the General Assembly. These are the fora where we have been raising these points and where we feel that we have not made the inroads that TPNW states parties want. So the fora that are listed are the ones where we probably have not yet raised these points. So the fact that the NPT is not listed there, it's because it's so obvious. And of course, we have in a few weeks the third NPT PrepCom coming up. The whole idea was that states parties will draw from this report. We hope that states parties will take some points for their own statements. Whether or not joint working papers, joint statements will follow, we don't know that yet. The time between the third meeting of states parties and the NPT PrepCom was rather short. I think it's probably more input for the RefCon that is going to be drawn from this. Yeah, but the whole idea is that the report should be used to promote ratifications of the treaty. So it's linked to universalization. And I think states parties have put additional emphasis at the third meeting of states parties on those efforts. But then, of course, how to engage with the skeptics, that's a very tricky issue. We can talk much about that. But so that should happen in the NPT, but should happen in other frameworks as well. And the feeling was that it is easier, or it is harder to deny a conversation about security than about the TPNW, because the TPNW is now often so it will continue to be difficult to engage some states specifically on the TPNW, but it should be possible to engage countries on the security arguments that are enshrined in the TPNW, which is a different way of framing the conversation. So maybe I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Gaukhar.
Thank you. Picking up on the centrality of security arguments, that both sides brings presumably a security argument to the table, maybe not to the same table at the moment. And in general terms, that seems to boil down to weighing the relative risk, right? It's a risk of a large-scale conventional war, or a risk of one or several states being, let's say, invaded and occupied by a more powerful country in the absence of nuclear deterrence, versus the consequences of a nuclear weapons use should we have nuclear deterrence in place and it fails. The likelihood of one scenario versus the other appears to be greater, perhaps differently to different sides of this kind of equation. And I think the dilemma then is, how do we address that? The fact that one side views perhaps the likelihood of one scenario as much greater as the other, and so they emphasize that side of the risk. Is NPT really the right forum for that? And Oliver, you specifically said that the NPT has to be the central forum for these kinds of discussions. Could you elaborate a little bit more about how to place that debate in the current NPT review process structure?
Yeah, I think that's a very very good and difficult question to answer. And we've had this discussion around risk reduction for some time. We had the agreement at the last review conference, which then didn't make it into an agreed final document because Russia torpedoed agreement. But I think good language that risk reduction is not a substitute or precondition for nuclear disarmament, which kind of captures part of the mood. I do think that the NPT can and should be a forum, and I do think there's a shared willingness, maybe not by all states, but by a broad majority, to go into these discussions. There are deep concerns, for example, about the implications of bringing artificial intelligence into nuclear command control communication systems, on the risks of nuclear war. Preventing nuclear war is, the primary purpose of the NPT. So there is a direct link to do that. I think, again, it's also a good way to engage those who are, not willing to sign the TPNW, but share some of the arguments and are, some of the concerns around that. Again, speaking from a German perspective, and Germany has been investing in discussions around the impact of new technologies on nuclear stability and disarmament for some time, and sponsored several big conferences and so on. So you can hook into these debates, if you like, and make these inroads. But not a good way to do that, to be very blunt, is to say, well, nuclear disarmament in the world free of nuclear weapons is the only sustainable way to address nuclear risks. Because that kind of, in a way, shuts down some of the debates and turns off some of your interlocutors. So that's, I think, where we have to try harder to make these debates. I mean, the other question, just very briefly, is if indeed, and unfortunately that looks not unlikely, there's no consensus in the NPT, the next review conference next year, to actually address these issues in a more meaningful way. No consensus because of other issues, even though this may be acceptable. What other fora do we have? And here the report lists some of the multilateral fora, but I think like-minded groups will have to become greater load bearers on these discussions. So simply by default, because at the moment, Russia has been blocking consensus for some time now. There's a concern that other nuclear weapon states, particularly the United States, may also become more difficult in terms of agreeing to such consensus documents. So what can we do then? But, that's another question that maybe is not for TPNW states to address, but something that probably will come up in the NPT context also. Thanks.
Can I also respond?
Yes, absolutely. I was going to go to you, but not before adding on a little bit to that, because Oliver specifically highlighted the risk reduction discussion, and that has gotten a bit controversial, right, in the past NPT meetings, including around this question of is the risk reduction as envisioned by the nuclear weapon states in particular, is seen by many countries as kind of designed to perpetuate possession while reducing the risk of use. Is there room, from your view, Alexander, for a more constructive engagement on this issue within the NPT risk reduction debate? And how diverse are the views of TPNW states in this regard? Because I think there is quite a bit of variation in terms of willingness to engage in this conversation without falling back to elimination or bust. Over to you.
That's a very good question. I just want to first go back to the way I think you framed it really well in terms of the difficulties of weighing. And I think the report tries to be very clear about that the level of uncertainty extends to all sides of the argument, that it is impossible to prove either way. So it is impossible to prove for those who argue for nuclear disarmament that nuclear weapons may not deter. But it is impossible for proponents of nuclear deterrence to say they are a guarantee for stability. So the key question is, what do we do with this uncertainty? And part of the problem is that too often certainty is projected when in reality there is no certainty. And I think the point that we are making in this report is that we have to acknowledge these uncertainties, which are very fundamental, but given the enormous stakes, we have to look more at what it is we actually do know. And it is absolutely clear that peer-reviewed research has added to the argument about the gravity if something goes wrong. So that's where the conversation has to go to. This is not to say that you're right and I'm wrong, and I fully share Oliver's view. You're not going to get to a good conversation with that mindset, but it is acknowledging the complexities of weighing and acknowledging the uncertainties that are there, but then looking more at what it is where there is certainty, and then what are the conclusions that need to be drawn out of that. Now, the NPT obviously should be the place to discuss this, but the way we have set up our work in the NPT doesn't lend itself very well to this kind of conversation. The NPT is very little debate and an endless array of statements. And then in the end, some chair tries to draw up some document that he or she hopes will not be blocked. But I think also for the future of the NPT, it is extremely important that we find a way to address these points, because if we do not address these points, the vast majority of countries whose security is, from their perspective, threatened by the practice of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence will feel increasingly disenfranchised. Now, on your very important point on risk reduction, my personal view, and also what Austria has said in statements, we don't say that we should not engage in a discussion on risk reduction, because from our perspective, any measure that would in any way reduce the risks of nuclear weapons is obviously something that's necessary and good. So we do not buy that this is a distraction from nuclear disarmament. It is very clear it's not a substitute, but any measure to reduce risk is a good one. The problem is the way the risk reduction discussion has been framed by countries that have these weapons. I'm not saying that the measures that they proposed are important because they could contribute to reducing risk, but it's far too narrow. It actually does not include a readiness to engage on the questions that are at the origin of nuclear risks, which is, of course, the practice of nuclear deterrence, which should be, these risks should be discussed. So I believe that we would have, this is a way where we could make the discussion in the NPT much more meaningful, where we could address risk reduction in a much broader sense, which would also bring in the countries on the non-nuclear weapons side, many of the NAM countries who have hesitations about it because they see this as just a ploy to divert from the discussion on Article 6. So if the discussion on risk reduction were to be framed much more broadly and really look at risks in a broader way, I think that would be very beneficial for the NPT and would actually move us forward on in terms of the conversation on many of the issues that we have raised in the report. So sorry for this lengthy answer.
Thank you for that. To develop a little bit further the questions about how to continue this conversation or pick up this conversation in the NPT, what I find is that most states do not deny the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. There might be some disagreement about, how much use it would take to have a truly catastrophic situation. But generally, states agree there are terrible humanitarian consequences. They almost uniformly express concern. But the discussion doesn't go much further than that. So the question to both of you is, what would be a more productive way to pick up the discussion of the humanitarian consequences, sort of linked, but not necessarily to the risk reduction? For example, Oliver, you mentioned in the report, there are some questions that states should be posing to the nuclear weapon states. And you, Alexander, mentioned that we don't know very much about how the consequences are being taken into account in nuclear planning, for example. What mitigating measures are there in place or planned and capacities? Do you think this could be picked up as a discussion in the NPT? And is transparency, as you, Oliver, brought up, that's the first point, is transparency debate the right place for that, to kind of have an interactive conversation with the states about the nuclear planning and the consequences and mitigation? I'm agnostic as to who wants to take it up first. Oliver, you look ready.
Yeah, I can give it a try. First, a brief remark to what Alexander said, and it's good to hear that the uncertainty that's acknowledged, or that is put forward with regard to the arguments of deterrence, supporters should also be applied to TPNW arguments. And I think that that I think is an important point to make, and can open a space for engagement. And that also should include the choice of topics. And that leads to your question, Gaukhar, that, yes, you need to talk about the humanitarian side of the issue, but you also need to address some of the uncomfortable arguments that are difficult for TPNW states, at least at the moment, to include, and I refer to some of them, including, the role of positive security assurances, for example. What do you tell South Koreans, and there's a broad majority in South Korea for developing nuclear weapons, how to provide their security, and really wrap your head around that, and not just tell them nuclear weapons are not the way. So I think that's, it's good to hear, and there's room here, I think, to engage. Your question on how to take the debate about humanitarian consequences forward and how to use it to bridge that gap, if I understood correctly, because there is, as you say, broad agreement that this, the humanitarian consequences are catastrophic. There's disagreement about any use of a nuclear weapon would have such catastrophic consequences, but that's maybe not, these are technical issues that maybe are not such a good place to start. I do think, we have to acknowledge that these are different discourses, if you like, that have been not speaking to each other enough. One issue that both sides can relate to is international humanitarian law. Countries, even nuclear, countries engaged in extended deterrence relationships quite often are proud advocates of international humanitarian law. And there are issues here. There are issues around nuclear planning and being involved in nuclear planning also, not only with relation to issues that are hard to get to, such as which targets would be chosen and, what are the consequences and how are these weighed, but also procedurally. Where is legal advice provided also to non-nuclear weapon states in this scenario of a potential nuclear weapons use? There's great work that Scott Sagan has done around that, describing how international humanitarian law considerations come into play in the United States. We know very little or almost nothing about how this, for example, is done in NATO. are there international lawyers in the nuclear planning group that actually advise on the international humanitarian law consequences of certain nuclear options? Would the German chancellor be advised by an international lawyer? Would other, in such a scenario? We actually don't know. And this, it must be possible for allies also, and also for nuclear weapon states, to describe the processes and how they are taking these law considerations into account, if indeed they argue that what they are doing in terms of being involved in nuclear planning and nuclear exercises and so on is compatible with nuclear. So that's, that could be one useful starting point for engaging on these issues. Thanks.
Thank you. Alexander, to you. And I would also mention that we know little or nothing about how IHL is taken into account by other nuclear weapon states. So we really only have some information about the United States. So that's very pertinent point. Alexander.
So your question on the humanitarian consequences, I think that is in a way that was at the starting point of why this consultative process was started, because they are broadly acknowledged, as you rightly say, but then the argument is the humanitarian consequences is what makes nuclear deterrence work. That's the one argument. And the other one is the humanitarian consequences are the reasons why nuclear weapons should never be used. But actually, the discussion doesn't actually then sort of drill more into detail. And I think that's the questions and that's the points that we try to raise in the report, to drill more into this. So one way of focusing the discussion more on the consequences is of course to highlight even further the facts-based set of arguments, the peer-reviewed research that has happened in the past 15, 20 years, and more research to come. For example, the UN study that has now been mandated in the resolution that was sponsored by Ireland and New Zealand. So there are many ways of doing this further to put more on these facts on the side of the scale, to be able to drill more into the question to what extent the construct of nuclear deterrence is sustainable, or what would change the calculus. I think so. That is an important aspect. And the report itself, coming to the transparency aspect, also following up what Oliver said, I fully agree with what he said on IHL. In fact, to my knowledge, it's only the US who has stated publicly that they would, any use of nuclear weapons would be done in accordance with IHL. But we don't know much more beyond that. We don't know very little from the other nuclear armed states. And the report actually contains, there is an annex to the report, which you can find on the TPNW meeting website. It's not part of the report, and that was done for cost reasons, so that it wouldn't have to be translated into all the 6 languages. You can find it at the website under additional background documentation. It contains a whole set of questions related to transparency, which follow the logic. TPNW states parties are threatened with consequences, would suffer the risks. There is very little information. We have a legitimate claim to request this information in order to be able to take measures at the domestic level, at an international level. And if we don't even know, if states don't even know the extent of the threat, the extent of the steps, the details, they are not able to take these steps. So I think that's the logic behind focusing on the transparency aspect, and I think there are very granular set of transparency requests, and some of them relate to IHL, and I think that would be a very good step to get more feedback, get more information by nuclear armed states on these aspects. And obviously, this is something that can and should be done in the NPT context.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions online. I will try to. I've been trying to incorporate some of the themes from the question into mine as well, and I'll try to condense some of the ones we received. One set of questions has to do with reactions of other countries and the possibility of engagement in forums such as the European Union. So to Oliver, the question is, how do you sort of interpret the lack of observers from NATO states in particular at the latest TPNW meeting of states parties? And the question to Austria is, how can Austria, question to Alexander is, how can Austria promote a debate on the report findings within the EU, within the European Union format? And maybe as a little bit of a tag on to Oliver, how do you think Germany and other states might receive that? So let's start with you, Oliver.
Yeah, thanks, Gaukhar. Quite obviously, the decision not to observe has to do also with this, highly polarized environment. Generally speaking, the concerns about security following Russia's attack on Ukraine and the nuclear threats, and a belief that nuclear weapons are part of the solution, not part of the problem. And that has certainly contributed to the decision not to participate. But I think it's also, this general climate didn't help. But I think it's also been very difficult to really build up constituencies for the TPNW, if you like, inside the system. If you look at the Green Party debate in Germany, for example, debate about disarmament has been sidelined almost completely in favor of discussing deterrence and defense issues. And I think that, cannot only be blamed on the circumstances, but also some soul searching by the disarmament community would be good. Why that has not been possible, and why these voices that we had inside the system were not able to prevail. And, this requires engagement with parliamentarians, for example, long-term, to help them with arguments, but also taking serious some of their concerns about weakening deterrence relationships and so on. And again, I think here TPNW advocates, if you can say so, should be resisting the temptation to pick their favorite topics, but also engage with uncomfortable issues more than they have done in the past. And, humanitarian concerns are one side of the equation, but what about the hard security arguments, and what intermediate steps can be taken to address these concerns about being vulnerable if indeed, for example, extended deterrence relationships are ended. Another way to do this, I think, is to point out again that, with Trump now having returned to the White House, that the argument that there's responsible stewardship really is becoming more difficult, and that these relationships, extended deterrence relationships, do rely on decision makers that act irresponsibly. So irresponsible behavior not only on the part of Russia, but also on the part of the United States. And, there is a huge concern about Chinese behavior and Chinese policies in terms of increasing nuclear weapons stockpiles. It would be good if, you know, the TPNW community were able to address these specific concerns rather than having blanket arguments that puts all nuclear weapon states into the same category. That makes it difficult to engage with policymakers who don't see it that way, who have concerns about specific countries and specific developments. So that, I think, is part of what could be done and should be done to get into these debates more, or what I would wish would happen more. Let me maybe leave it there. Thanks.
Well, I think we keep coming up to this issue of sort of the specific concerns and generalized consequences and the risks viewed from one state versus the risk viewed as kind of from the perspective of humanity. And there's no easy answer to that. I don't think we'll find it today, but it's certainly something that has to be addressed somewhere in the NPT or different form. How do you view the potential for the EU to engage on this topic, Alexander? And as a follow-up, there was a question about victim assistance and possible participation of states outside the TPNW in that, including the European Union.
I found it interesting how Oliver I think the way he phrased it was sort of the humanitarian arguments is sort of one thing, and I know that he of course takes them very seriously, but hard security is another. And I think it's the whole point of the report is to make the case that the concerns about if something goes wrong is hard security for the countries that are not engaged in nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. So the crux of the matter is that the security policy approach of one side of the argument creates security concerns for the other side of the argument. So that's not even acknowledged. That also, I mean, is in a way coming to the point of lecturing that you made in the initial. So I think it is important to acknowledge that this is hard security, and it's a realist approach to security to try to remove the threat that is created by nuclear weapons policies. And of course, the policies of country A with nuclear weapons compared to country B with nuclear weapons is different. But it doesn't change the fact that the aggregate policies of countries relying on nuclear weapons are the ones that create security threats related to nuclear weapons for all those countries who are not part of this exercise. And that's something that needs to be acknowledged as well, and at least lead to a conversation where these points are heard. Now, it is not possible to have a discussion in the EU on the TPNW because that has been rehearsed. We have very different views in the EU, but I would say it should also be possible to have a discussion about the risks, about the scientific evidence related to humanitarian consequences, and about the challenges of trying to weigh this, specifically since the discussion in many European countries is going into the direction of putting more emphasis on nuclear weapons. It should be even more possible and even necessary to also have a conversation about the risks. And then the EU, of course, presents itself and is a promoter of international law and multilateralism. We need to have a discussion. What is the impact of all of this, including the discussion that's going on in Europe at the moment on multilateralism and on the NPT, which is so challenged anyway. So there are ways of having this discussion which is not linked to the TPNW, but it's legitimate points which should be part of a policy discussion also in Europe at the moment. And victim assistance, I agree entirely. That is seen also rightly, probably by some countries that are not likely to join the TPNW anytime soon, as a way of showing engagement and of course underscoring that these are valid humanitarian points. And I'm sure that this is going to be possible in the future. Of course, at the moment, TPNW states parties are engaged in discussing how they themselves are going to implement Article 6 and 7 of the TPNW. And the question of how non-states parties could be part of this discussion in a way logically should follow once we have consolidated this. There is, of course, the discussion now on the trust fund, which we were not in a position to conclude at the third meeting of states parties. Maybe we will take some decisions at the review conference end of 2026. And of course, this is an area that should be open for engagement also to other countries who may have hesitations to look at the prohibition aspect of the TPNW, but are more open to look at the dimension of assisting victims and environmental remediation. Thank you.
Thank you. To continue maybe a little bit this dichotomy that you've both pointed out, the humanitarian consequences argument being seen as separate from the hard security concerns and the need to kind of depart a bit from that for there to be an actual conversation. And so on the one hand, there should be recognition that humanitarian consequences are the basis for actual security concerns one side, but it will also mean for the other side to accept that there are some real motivations for reliance on nuclear deterrence and honest belief in its security, so in its benefits, without dismissing it as out of hand as an irresponsible policy. And that brings me to the question from an online participant, Louis Reitman, who points out that the TPNW from the get-go was based on the goal of delegitimizing nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. And so if you were to engage in the softer conversation with the believers and proponents of nuclear deterrence, would that in a way undermine the very perspective that has led to the negotiation of the TPNW? Alexander, yes, I think that's to you.
That's an interesting question. It's got a political dimension and it's got a legal dimension. The logic that TPNW states parties have followed, I think, is outlined very clearly, that from their perspective, the consequences of these weapons are too grave, the risks are too high, no one should have them. So it is an approach to delegitimize these weapons based on the consequences and risks. That has a legal dimension, of course, only for the TPNW states parties, because it's very clear from an international law point of view that we are not in a position where we can talk about customary international law probably for a while, and then even if we get to the numbers, there are some countries that have made it clear that they are persistent objectors. So from a legal side, there's a long way to get to this point. But from a political point, the more, that's at least how I see the theory of change of the TPNW, the more we highlight these consequences and these risks, we underpin them with the science that is there, that is growing. This body of evidence is growing. The more possibilities this will create to change the calculus around nuclear weapons, so that countries themselves that have these weapons or rely on these weapons understand that it is not a legitimized, that is not a legitimate and certainly not a sustainable way of guaranteeing international security. So I do not see this as a contradiction, to be honest. So That's how I would leave it. I think it can only work through changing the calculus around security and nuclear weapons, and that's what TPNW states parties are engaged in. TPNW states parties cannot wish away nuclear weapons. They cannot force anyone to give up these weapons, but they can, in a discursive process, change the legitimacy, change the view on the legitimacy and sustainability of nuclear weapons.
Oliver, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, just very briefly. And I really think, these were important points by Alexander. If you are afraid that engaging with those who disagree with you undermines your purpose and your argument, then you would be in trouble. I know that you've said the opposite, actually, if I understood correctly, Alexander. I just want to make that point again. And I'm also working for an organization that is actually based in a nuclear weapon state, and also being in touch with colleagues in nuclear weapon states. One of the great achievements, I think, of the TPNW is stirring up the debates in nuclear weapon states, and provoking. You're all aware of some of the reactions that have been provoked by it, which are telling. So I think engagement, even if it doesn't help to convince the other side, can be politically quite useful. And I think also the other important point you make, that customary international law is not around the corner, and that the TPNW for some time, if understood correctly, will take some time before it will be considered a customary international law, may make it easier to engage. As far as I recall, that after the TPNW was adopted, was one of the top concerns. And there was almost no statement by nuclear weapon states and also by NATO and others which didn't flag that they do not consider this treaty as having an effect on the customary international law. If that's no longer a concern, and you're willing to or able to acknowledge that, that should lower the burden, the barrier for engagement. I think also, and maybe one small point, I'm in reaction to your previous statement on the positive obligations and states being able to contribute to address, victims, to contribute to victims' assistance and environmental remediation. I haven't been, following that discussion in detail. I don't know what the practical difficulties are, but looking from the outside, I don't quite understand why first TPNW states have to agree on such a mechanism by themselves and then engage non-states parties. There may be reasons that I'm not aware of, but I know, that some non-states parties in principle would have been willing to contribute to joint effort, but this never materialized. So again, I may be missing something here because I didn't follow that debate, but I think it would be, as you said, one of the issues where things can be done together, maybe even under the NPT. Why could there not be such a fund among the coalition of the willing in the NPT to do something like this? So I just want to throw that out as one of the issues where I think one hopefully can do things together. Thanks.
Thank you. There might be a need for a separate webinar on the victim assistance and issues surrounding that discussion and how to link it to the NPT or elsewhere. That will be interesting, but we don't have the scope here for that. We have a question from Patricia Lewis, who you both know well, who I think is trying to develop, would like to hear more on the arguments surrounding positive security assurances. And you, Oliver, brought this up in particular a couple of times as kind of one of the important topics for countries in Europe, especially, but also I'm guessing East Asia at this moment. And the problem that Patricia highlights is the fears of escalation, right? If you provide support in case of an attack. And do either of you have any thoughts on having that discussion without sort of resorting to the usual set of concerns and arguments, and what does it say about the reliance and limits of reliance on nuclear deterrence?
I can give it a try.
Yes.
I do think that that's a very important way to come at the issue. And I agree with Alexander that the costs and risks associated with nuclear weapons and even participating in nuclear sharing arrangements are ignored to a large degree in political debates about the real or supposed security benefits of nuclear weapons. And I've been trying to highlight that here, but it's difficult because most people kind of have the impression that, you have this, and I've been trying to avoid the term nuclear umbrella, which is, a clever term actually in terms of describing these arrangements, because an umbrella, you just kind of unfold. It's, it doesn't have any negative effects, just protects you against the rain. And if it stops raining, you just fold it up again and put it away. But it doesn't really cost much. You may poke somebody in the eye with it, but that's really rarely happens. But otherwise, there are no risks associated with having an umbrella. I learned from Kjörf Eglund actually that in the early days, these weapons deployed in Europe, for example, were called nuclear lightning rods. And then, terminology changed. So it's the way we talk about these extended relationships also. And I think, one of the interesting things I, at least here in Berlin, have observed, and there was a question from Regina Hagen about the INF deployments. To some degree, the discussion around escalation risks has become more honest. We've had briefings and public briefings you can find on YouTube on the deployments, where it's quite openly argued, and I'm not aware that this has been done before, that yes, in a crisis, these weapons could be used to take out potential nuclear threats from Russia before missiles are launched. The analogy is that these weapons could be used not to shoot the arrow, but to shoot, the person who is shooting the arrow, actually. So it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that, this kind of fear of being left unprotected actually brings out a more open debate on escalation risks. And so I think it is possible to engage with that. But again, that requires engagement on the details of these escalation dynamics and how nuclear weapons come into the play here. But I think it's one of these inroads that can be used to point out the risks and costs. Thanks.
Alexander, what's the potential for TPNW states to engage in that kind of discussion of escalation scenarios and responses?
Well, I think it's linked to the points on transparency that I have made. I mean, what is it TPNW states parties can say about that? We know, we have a pretty good idea what happens if something goes wrong. We read and hear what experts say, that the risk of escalation are huge. We know that hundreds of books have been written about escalation ladders, escalation dominance, but it's theory, because we cannot put it into, we can't falsify it because we can't afford to falsify it. We hear from US generals saying that there are no tactical weapons, all nuclear weapons are strategic. We also hear that essentially war games that cross the threshold of using nuclear weapons end with all-out nuclear war, or tend to end with all-out nuclear war. So TPNW states parties, I think, or non-nuclear weapon states more broadly, I think have a real interest to, and a legitimate interest to find out, to understand this more. So I think it's really incumbent on nuclear weapon states to provide more information about that, about the level of confidence they have to deal with escalation, when everything that we hear points into the direction that the risks are just, the risks and consequences are just huge. So I think the interest is absolutely there, but we would need to get readiness for more openness from at least from some of the nuclear weapon states, to at least be in a position to better understand the risks that are being faced through escalation.
Thank you. We have reached our time, but before we close, I would like to give our speakers 2 minutes each for any follow-up concluding remarks, if you have any. Alexander?
Thank you. First of all, thanks to Oliver for very, very good comments. I really enjoyed that. And thanks to the questions posed through the chat. I just want to, the concluding point I want to say is to highlight that at the end of the day, we all don't really know for certain, and should acknowledge this much, much more. That in the almost fever pitch-like discussion that we see in some quarters about the need to increase focus even more on nuclear weapons, it is important to also find a way to have conversation about the legitimate security concerns that this creates for the rest of the world. So I very much hope that this report that TPNW States Parties worked on quite a lot can be a tool to engage in this conversation more. I encourage, it's a lengthy document. It reflects quite a serious effort from TPNW States Parties to put points forward on which to engage. And I really hope that this is being taken up, because the situation is very dire, and we are on the cusp of sliding into a much, much more dangerous world when it comes with nuclear weapons. So please read the report and make up your own mind on the arguments that are being put forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. Over to you, Oliver.
Yeah, read the report. I agree. It's a good report. You know, as I said, it's a useful compendium of the arguments that need to be brought to the table. Again, my main point was that, you know, willingness to engage requires also going to uncomfortable places, engaging with arguments that you find difficult to refute so easily, and reciprocity. And that's, I think, you know, sometimes what's been lacking, particularly from nuclear weapon state side, but not only at times. You know, we all like to be in comfortable places, but particularly in these times where polarization is becoming so harsh, we need to be ready to also pick up the arguments that we find difficult to refute. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it there. Thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you both very much. I will not attempt to conclude this other than highlight that indeed the circumstances in which we find ourselves heighten the risk to almost unprecedented levels, and that I think does require all of us to step out of our comfort zone to find the right place and forum to have a more frank and constructive discussion on the risks and benefits, and perceived risks and perceived benefits. With that, thank you both very much for your remarks. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. Thank you for your questions online, and my apologies for not being able to pose all of them to our speakers. And with that, I'm happy to conclude the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.